Good afternoon, everyone. My name is John Mitchell, and I'd like to welcome you to the ODI for the launch of a new LNAP report, Transforming Change, which we have here. It's on your seats, so please do take a copy. And of course, it's also outside on the shelves outside, so you can take them from there if you haven't got one on your seat. I'd also like to welcome our online participants. You can't see us, sorry, we can't see you, but you can see us, I hope, and hear us clearly. And we'll look forward to hearing from you later when you have an opportunity to join in the discussion on the online chat room. Now, before we get going, there's a few housekeeping points. And so, fire exits, in case of emergency, the assembly place is... You go out the way that you came in, you turn left under the bridge, and apparently we assemble outside Nando's. So there we go. The event is being the event is being live streamed and recorded, and it will go on the LNAP website. And so Chatham House rules do not apply. You can all join the conversation on Twitter, and the hashtag is LNAP31. And just to get us going, we'd like to take a sounding about what all of you think about how good humanitarians are at managing change. And our comms team, I understand, have organised a very, very quick, simple survey, which we're going to see on screen now. And you can reply to this link on the screen. There it is, there's the question. The humanitarian system is good at change. You can strongly disagree, slightly agree, or strongly agree. So if you'd like to do that now, that would be really great, and we can just quickly take a sounding. I'll tell you what, I'll just give you a little time to do that. I'll just say a few words about why this report is so important. And I think the answer is that much of this discussion has centred on what should change in the humanitarian system and why it should change. But there's been much less attention paid to the process by which change actually happens in the humanitarian system. And this report has attempted to redress this balance, and I think it's done a really good job in doing this. And so this afternoon we're going to take some insights from this report and some lessons from past change processes like the transformative agenda, and then take a critical look at some of the change processes that are happening today, like the grand bargain and the new way of working, to name a couple. So I wonder, have we got results from this? We do have results, and so here we have. Let's just see how good we think the system is at change. And so, oh goodness, we don't think it's very good, do we? So 45, okay, so nearly half of you, oh, it's changing all the time, it's changing all the time, it's making me dizzy. Nearly half of you disagree with that statement. Is it 50? It's 50-50, isn't it? Mm-hmm. More or less.
No, it's half disagree, and then another quarter slightly disagree.
Oh, okay.
So the people in the agreeing, it's currently 20%. It's only about 20%.
20% agree with that?
To some degree, and everyone else thinks not good at change.
Okay, so we're a pessimistic crowd, I'm afraid. But nevertheless, we might come back to this at the end of the day and see if we've changed our mind after we hear from the panellists. I think there's going to be some very searching questions in this discussion, and we have three panellists who are extremely well placed to help us answer them. And on my left, I'll introduce them to you now. We have Andras this is going to be difficult. Andras Horvath?
That works.
I don't think it really did. He's being very polite. He's project manager at the Global Public Policy Institute in Berlin, GPPI, and he's the lead author of the Independent Grand Bargain Report and he's a member of the team that reviewed the transformative agenda 5 years after its launch. And previously, Andreas was a delegate with the ICRC in Iraq. And sitting next to me, all the way from Geneva, is Melissa Pitotti, and she's the Acting Director of Policy at ICFA, the International Council for Voluntary Agencies. And Melissa's team focuses on forced displacement, humanitarian financing, humanitarian coordination and partnership, and she's actively involved in the grand bargain process. And at the end of the table, we have Sir Brendan Gormley, and Brendan is an international development consultant. He's chair of the CEDAC network and Accountability Now, and he used to be the CEO of the Disasters Emergency Committee for a long time, several years. And before that, he was the Africa director at Oxfam, also for a long time, if I may say so.
It is true.
It's true. In fact, it's 10 years. I've got it down here. Brendan's on the board of many civil society organisations. He's had a distinguished career, and he's been part of, or very well cited on, many of the humanitarian change initiatives over recent years. Before we get to the report itself, I understand our comms team have been so busy, we've got something else to show you. It's an animation. I hope that all the online participants can see this as well.
As humanitarians, we spend a lot of time debating what needs to change in our sector. This is important, but we also need to look at how things change. When you're trying to change something, your understanding of how that thing works matters. We often think of the humanitarian system as a machine. If there's a problem, we identify what's not working and try to fix that broken part. This approach makes us feel in control. But is this the most effective way to understand change? What if the humanitarian system is less like a machine and more like a human mind? We all know the mind is a hard thing to change. People aren't always rational, and perceptions, fears, and emotions can derail change processes. Or what if we think of it as an ecosystem of independent organisms, acting and reacting to each other and to changing situations? Normally, their individual adjustments don't amount to much, but lots of little changes can build up to a tipping point and reshape the system as a whole. None of these analogies capture exactly how the humanitarian system works, but each can teach us something about change. Firstly, change is about people. People's perspectives about change vary. We need to listen to these, be open to disagreement, and communicate the reasons and nature of change as clearly as possible. Secondly, we have less control over change than we think. We need to be prepared to adapt to unexpected shifts and support positive changes already underway. Change takes a long time, involves many actors, and success is not guaranteed. So a realistic approach is key. How do you see the humanitarian system? Are you prepared to see it differently?
I thought I recognised Diane Abbott's voice as the voiceover on that, but maybe I'm wrong. Let's go to the report. At the end of the table here, we have Paul Knox-Clark, who is Head of Research at ALNAP. Paul is the lead author of this report. Paul, what's in it?
Thanks, John. I really like that animation, actually. I thought it was really good. And it will be, I think, on the website and available for people to download and use. Great. Yes, it will. So that's good. Yeah, I mean, the idea of the animation, some of these things will come up again, but it was really to think about change in a different way, to kind of just sort of take a visual approach to it. But more importantly than thinking about change in a different way, I think, was really thinking about change at all. As John said, it is sort of kind of amazing when you look back at, sort of foundation of ALNAP and HAP and the sphere standards and transformative agenda and humanitarian reform and the grand bargain and, so many attempts to change things and so many vocal statements and meetings and people really engaged in the idea of things have to change. So many people believing that change is important. And yet spending so very little time thinking actually about how it gets done. It's a bit like sort of launching a massive humanitarian response without thinking about HR, logistics, access, any of the actual doing of the thing, but just saying, oh, well, we want to shift 20,000 tons over there and we're sure it'll happen somehow. So you have all these change processes and at the level of the whole system, but also, I mean, I'm sure in your organizations you either currently have or have had or will have at some point quite soon organizational change processes going on. And very often, they don't really ask that question about how can we do stuff, but they just follow this default pattern, and it's a default pattern. I think it's a route that many of us have walked often. You get posts created to manage this new change project, you get a change project, new structures, policies get written, there's some training in how to do the policies. And then at some point down the line, maybe there's an evaluation of this change project, and generally that evaluation says something like, well, yeah, produce some new structures, and there's some new procedures in place now. And they're making a bit of a difference in some areas. But basically, the procedures aren't really being followed in the way that we expected them to. And we need more buy-in or more political will wasn't there. And we've read the evaluations, and they are fairly similar in their results. And so before we go over that all over again and come up with similar evaluations, it's worth, I think, us all thinking about why all this doing doesn't fundamentally change our being. Why all the new units and guidance and guidelines and don't actually seem to often really get purchase on our fundamental behaviour. And that, as the film suggested, means firstly sort of examining our assumptions. And sort of going beyond examining, the assumption that this is a machine and we can somehow just kind of have a plan and know what is going to happen in advance and it will follow the plan and we can act on something which is separate from us, which is kind of where all this project planning and the production of guidance idea comes from. I mean, who here is trying to learn something new, a new sport, or just put your hand up? Yeah? And who here is involved in social change, women's empowerment, diversity issues in their lives? Yeah? And do any of those people who put their hands up think that you're going to be able to do that according to a plan? In the next, let's say, the next funding period of a year? Is that going to get done? I mean, I'm assuming that for many of you the answer is no. Yeah? So we kind of know that social processes, when we engage in them, in our own lives, are difficult, and that learning and changing, even ourselves as individuals, is difficult. And I think, as the film said, when we start thinking about that, probably, and I'm afraid, the fundamental lesson is that change is going to take longer and it's going to be more difficult and less programmed and less likely to follow the tracks than, a sort of planning approach might suggest. And yet we kind of know that, and it's just, and I know it, and yet we all, or many of us, I personally, default back to that, even knowing that it's not actually what experience suggests. There's something very, very comforting in the idea that you can have this project plan and do a change like that. So what we did with the meeting was we had this really excellent opportunity to talk to and to hear from lots of people who had been right down in the weeds, really trying to work with complex and difficult change programs of all kinds. And you know, it was a great luxury, and I'd like to just bring out, I mean, there's much more in the paper, of course, but I'd like to bring out 5 of the things that were pretty consistent across most of the presentations and discussions that we had at the meeting. And there are 5 things that were common in those changes that seemed to work better. So where things worked better, these things seemed to take place, and where they didn't, where these things weren't done, the change program seemed to be less effective, if that makes sense. The first lesson was about bringing people together. Change, we saw time and time again in these stories how change initiatives ripple out in an organization or a system. We think it's just about a technical fix, perhaps, but actually to make that happen, all sorts of other changes, great examples of how finance had to be involved, how HR had to be involved, how other organizations had to get involved. You know, the ripples went much further than people originally thought when they were sitting down to think about the change. And because of that, changes that recognized that this was going to happen, and at the outset of the process and throughout the process brought people in, seemed to be much more effective. That is, they brought in broader groups of stakeholders to do a variety of things, to talk about how the change might affect them, to identify potential resistance to the change, things that people were worried about, and to create, if you like, a social reality. The more people who were talking about this thing, the more inevitable it began to seem. And so this creation of platforms and social reality was very important in a lot of the successful programs that we heard about. The second lesson, copy, don't design. I think Duncan Green has written a lot about this, and we saw it again in several examples. Changes that started with a blank piece of paper saying, okay, what would the perfect look like? Let's forget we've got all this stuff here and just design it out. You know, it didn't really work so well, you know. But changes that started saying somewhere in here, something, however small, something is working, and where the objective of the change process was to kind of fan that spark into a fire, tended to be much more successful. And why? Because they were working with something which could already exist in the system. Yeah? The potential for that change already existed. So copying, not designing, seems to be a good tactic. Thirdly, act, don't plan. In a changing environment, everyone's acting at once. We saw that, you know, everyone's working on each other, and it's long been recognized by Napoleon and many others that planning, the first thing that actually happens when you start doing things is that the plan goes out the window. It becomes redundant. If you think about, you know, playing football, as John introduced us at the meeting, if you think about campaigning for election, if you think about bringing up a teenager, you know, none of these things are things which you're probably going to do by numbers, you know, according to 1, 2, 3, 4, following the plan. What tends to happen is that you act first, see what's working and do a bit more of that, and don't do the stuff that is working. It's actually thought of in other areas as strategy in the rearview mirror. Yeah? And it seems to be a much more effective way to actually get things that work to happen. It also allows you to take advantage of opportunities. And a lot of the changes that we saw, and this I don't think does come through really in the report, but a lot of the changes we saw had been catalyzed because something had happened. Sadly, often something bad had happened. And that made people engage with an idea. And when they were engaging with the idea, it was possible for the change actors to do something. Perversely, and this was one of the difficulties I think in writing the report, there's a lot of yin and yang in the old change business. You know, there seems to be a lot of contradictory messages come through what works, or at least messages that are in tension with each other. So on the one hand, it seemed that, you know, more flexibility and less planning was important, but on the other, there are things that need to be planned. Knowing the kind of creating a container, a set of boundaries within which these things can happen, within which flexibility can happen, seemed to be very important. And these were very simple boundaries. They were making sure everyone agreed basically on what the goal was, and making sure everyone agreed on who did what. Yeah? So it's not, you know, it's not a really complex plan. It's just some boundaries within which there's a lot more freedom to act. And then finally, the last lesson, and this is just a quote from several people at the meeting, is put people at the centre. In this weird kind of way, we often kind of seem to think that organisations or departments or business processes are the basic elements, the basic components of organisational change. And they're not. People are the basic components of organisational change. No change is going to occur without people in some way, great or small, changing their behaviour. And that means that instead of, you know, office politics and people's likes and dislikes and their fears and being a sort of annoying kind of thing out on the side that we kind of have to deal with peripherally, that is actually the central work of change. Those things are the centre of the work. Practically, what that means is giving people a lot of chances to express themselves. It means listening. And I'd like to, I'll finish, if I may, just with a personal example of this. So I'm moving house, and my children, who are young teenagers, absolutely cannot stand the idea of moving house. And on several occasions, they burst into tears, and I'm sorry, but I know they're not going to be watching me, so that's okay. Burst into tears just at the whole idea. Yeah, there was nothing to be done about this. It was only when I'd had the time and actually slowed it right down to listen to why they didn't want to move, that I realised that it was all about, for my daughter, the fact she had just redecorated her room and she wanted her friends to see it. And my son thought by moving house we would be changing rugby team and he'd be going over to the opposition. Yeah. Now, I didn't know that, but as soon as I knew that, we could be very clear that your friends can come and see the house before we move, yeah? And there's no way that you're going to play for Oxford Harlequins. It's never going to happen. So you're staying with your team. And those two things dealt with that. You know, the move is now something that everyone is behind. And it's a little story, but it's actually, when I was a change consultant, a story I have seen often in the sort of executive suites of large organisations. Because people haven't had an opportunity to explore why they are resisting, they just resist. So people and their emotions should be at the centre of the process. Thank you very much.
Paul, thank you very much. It was really clear, some excellent insights. Now we're going to go to our panel to get their reactions. And I'm going to start with Andras. And I've got a couple of questions for you, Andras. And, I mean, you have looked at the transformative agenda and the grand bargain. I think you've done evaluations of both of them, or reviews of both of them. So I'd like to ask you about the differences between the transformative agenda and the grand bargain. What differences you have seen in the processes that they adopted, and also, you know, a more general question about: do you think, on that basis, that the system, the humanitarian system, has the ability to learn and evolve accordingly? Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, and congratulations, Paul, for this report. When I read through, I found it to be a very useful frame to think about change, so I found it very valuable. Going to your question about the transformative agenda and the grand bargain, maybe I start with the TA, the transformative agenda, and I assume that everyone in the room is aware of these change processes.
Do you know what? I would just remind people what the transformative agenda is, if I were you, just very briefly, if you can.
Okay, I won't spend much time though.
No.
But basically, it's an interagency reform that aimed to improve the effectiveness of aid. It was, and I'll get to that point. It was primarily designed as a response to large-scale natural disasters, so improve the predictability of the response, to improve the the quick surge that is prompted by a natural disaster. So the transformative agenda, as it was conceived, it was very similar to the humanitarian reform in that regard, was decreed from the top. So this mechanistic idea of change. So they set out a number of protocols, panels, processes on how the humanitarian system, the joint response, should change. So going back to that little video, it was the first kind of mechanistic change. But there are clear differences in how the change process was managed. And the transformative agenda had a hands-on approach with a group of leaders, the emergency directors group, which is basically a group of emergency directors from each UN agency and a few NGOs. They regularly discussed opportunities and challenges in the rollout of the protocols. They conducted country visits, commissioned operational peer reviews. So basically what we saw there is that you have a cookie-cutter method to change, but on top of that, or on the bottom of that, you have a live problem solving by this group of managers. And I think that is a quite powerful tool, a quite powerful idea on how to change. Yet, and we think when we looked at the transformative agenda, we saw great results, some results, but the extent of change was not perhaps as desired. So there was much to be improved. And one reason is that there was a certain mission creep that happened with the transformative agenda. So it was meant to be applied in large-scale sudden onset natural disasters, and eventually it was applied to conflict situations. And I believe this mission creep was one of the factors that the transformative agenda became one of these bloated, process-heavy change initiatives. And there's another issue there, which was perhaps a design flaw, we could call it. Donors were not subjects of the reform, and it took a long time, I believe, until donors started to see themselves as part of the problem and the solution. So it was more like donors telling aid organizations how to improve, what to improve. So it took time to get to that realization. Now the Grand Bargain, this is the most recent change initiative that was launched at the World Humanitarian Summit, and that I hope that is still the flagship proposal today. It's quite a different animal, and when I discuss some of the characteristics, I think you'll recognize that there have been improvements, perhaps as a result of learning, maybe not, maybe yes, but there have been improvements to how the transformative agenda was conceived and implemented. So the Grand Bargain focuses on results instead of defining the process, the way to how to get there. So basically, it allows aid organizations and donors to reach the targets on their own path, choose their own path. Sure, these targets that the Grand Bargain defines could have been a little bit more ambitious. So if you look at the cash, for example, it only includes an aspiration of using more cash transfer programming. So, I mean, you can have problems, but by design, setting targets and results rather than focusing on the process is, I think, a great feat and very promising. And in our assessment of the Grand Bargain that we finished this June, and I left a few copies outside on the gallery if you're interested, we saw that follow-up was pretty good. I think it causes some sort of optimism. We should just maintain peer and public pressure. Then another important point I wanted to raise here is this: the Grand Bargain learned from this process overload. There was a conscious effort that the reform does not lead to an increase in process demands. Importantly, donors have become part of the deal, and that's pretty revolutionary. So there is this idea of quid pro quo between donors and aid organizations. This has been instrumental in creating the Grand Bargain, but we found that it doesn't really play a role today. And I think there is still a lot of confusion of what this quid pro quo actually entails. So what are donors supposed to give? What is part of this core bargain? It is, and I'll get to that in a second, but I think that this quid pro quo is a very powerful instrument to address some of the deep-seated structural issues. So it holds a lot of potential, but it's also, it could lead to impasse. It could lead to a breakdown of trust, and perhaps that's what we're observing today. But let me just conclude this, that what the quid pro quo, what the goal of this is, and what I think is, and what I read out of the Grand Bargain is, it's a shift in agency and decision making away from donors to aid organizations, which would allow these aid organizations to focus better on the response and for less, and at the same time not compromising current levels of accountability to taxpayers. And I thought that one of the reports that you have here in this house, which is the time to let go, I think that phrase, letting go, kind of embraces that. And so I would just say that, so far, and that's a little bit worrying, and maybe later we can address that as well. So far we have seen more the dark side of this quid pro quo. So we have seen donors holding their own progress hostage to aid organizations' progress on transparency or on cutting management costs. And that is very worrying, and that, again, can lead to a spiral, downward spiral in terms of relations, and can be very dangerous.
And just that's very, very interesting indeed. We'll come back to Paul, because I think it would be great if you had a reaction to that. But staying on the Grand Bargain, I'm going to turn to Melissa. You're very involved with the Grand Bargain. Oh, good. Okay. Well, it would be great perhaps if you could pick up on the points Andras made there about the quid pro quo thing. But also, I wanted to ask you if you could pick anything from this paper and make it happen in the Grand Bargain process. What would it be, and how likely do you think it would be to happen?
Great. Well, I want to start by just saying congratulations. I think this paper for me was like taking a walk down memory lane. On every other page, I would read something that really reminded me of a change process that I had been involved in the last 15 years. So really, congratulations there. And I'd start by also just laying out the premise of the Grand Bargain as a change process. I think it was a brilliantly designed change process from the very beginning. And if you look at the elements of the paper, it said we're not really looking at the system as a mechanistic system where you can change a cog in the wheel. They were really taking an interest model where they said donors and implementers will come in equal numbers to the table, so 15 and 15, and they will have equal footing as they negotiate their agreements. There are 10 work streams, and each work stream was led by a donor and an implementer. ICFA was involved with Germany, leading the work stream on reporting. I'd also say that from the paper's perspective, it looked at the political dimension very well. You might have power as a donor because you're bringing resources, but some of the really best negotiators were those who are also bringing information, they were bringing knowledge, they were bringing relationships, they were bringing networks, they were bringing proximity to the ground. So really, if you could capitalize on that in a skilled way, you could really make an influence in the outcome of the negotiations. I think another important piece of the paper that we need to emphasize is that the Grand Bargain was really a multi-stakeholder process, which is really important in having that buy-in. I'd say that we need to learn lessons from this for the new way of working, which for the time being is a very UN-centric process. So if I would pick one thing from the paper to address the dark side of what Andras had just said, It's like taking the lens of the mind. The system is a mind. Here we see that if you look at the system as a mind, people are resistant to change. Even if their leaders have agreed to making a change at the top, once you actually have to implement the change, when you have to talk to these departments who will have to change the way they do business, they would start to fear that change because it has an impact on them. And I think here, if we look at the system as a mind, the thing that you have said in the paper that we should look at is communication to support change. So when we talk about communication, it's people understanding, why are we doing the grand bargain in the first place? We've kind of forgotten. It's the understanding the benefits. So if we look at the quid pro quo, it's if you're increasingly transparent, you will not have to do as many reports. We will reduce the level of earmarking. It's to understand that these benefits are supposed to accrue to those who have done the change. ICFA has tried to help with the communication because it's become a very complicated process. You might have read our paper, The Grand Bargain Explained. We did a paper on the Global Refugee Compact, and we'll be soon issuing a paper on the New Way of Working Explained. But that's one-way communication. You're reading a document. What your paper on change has said is you need platforms for two-way communication. And here, we would want to see the disagreements. Maybe there are people that see there are potential repercussions for taking on a change. Let's hash it out in an open setting. And I would close by looking at your suggestion on looking at monitoring in a way where you have a platform for the stakeholders to come together and say, we have a common picture of what's happening on the ground now. We want to reflect on what we've done, and we want to connect people to the process because it's about people. It's not necessarily about organizations. So what we have done yesterday, my colleague Jeremy is here. He's running our Less Paper, More Aid initiative. We brought 5 of the Grand Bargain work streams together. The ones that are dealing most directly with donor conditions. So transparency, reporting, multi-year funding planning, reducing duplication and management costs, reducing earmarking. We brought them all together as co-conveners, and we really learned about where each thing stood. We talked about the quid pro quo, regaining that element, but we also tried to see where can we sequence, where can we prioritize, where can we have synergy. And I would challenge, if we could take one thing from this paper, could we have more platforms like that for some of the other work streams that you care about? Localization, participation revolution, the humanitarian development nexus. There are other parts of the Grand Bargain, and sometimes it's hard to follow them all at once, but to have that kind of platform. And the last thing on the leadership point, you talk about leadership providing vision, but also there are many leaders in a change process. And yesterday's event that we were part of, a co-convener stood up and said, I'm willing to host. So can we find more of these leaders that are willing to support those kind of platforms?
Melissa, that's great. Thank you very much. Just to make sure I completely understood, are you suggesting that the increased communication, better communication within the Grand Bargain is the answer to this dark side that Andreas has mentioned?
We've been talking about communication in 3 ways within our organizations. Some of us work in very large organizations that haven't fully understood the process. We talk about communications within the Grand Bargain signatories, and also communications more broadly to those who think that we were negotiating this in a dark, smoke-filled room. The idea is not to be an exclusive club, but to reach out. And when I'm talking about communication, it's about exchanging information, but also having that platform to sort out some of these problems. So there's a reason why donors haven't necessarily made as much progress on things like increasing funding to multi-year programs, because they need better visibility on the planning side. So I think that that this kind of platform would be quite helpful.
Andreas, is she right?
I think communication is key. But when I think about the quid pro quo actually between donors and aid organizations, I imagine a strategic game. I imagine that on the country level, you have the humanitarian country team and you have donors, and they have to, agree on what are the toughest issues, the thorniest issues that we just cannot, make progress on. And I think that they have to lay down their clear expectations of what they expect from the other, and then they also need to, think about what kind of leverage they have against the other. In many contexts, and this might be, going a little bit further away from Melissa's point, but in many contexts, you think that, in most contexts, you would think that donors have the upper hand, right, in these negotiations. And in fact, often you find that aid organizations can block reform, they can block pressure. Often in certain contexts, high visibility contexts, you see donors that, just have a huge pressure to spend.
Yeah.
And which leaves aid organizations in a very good negotiating position. So, for me, the quid pro quo is about, laying down the expectations, and it's about thinking through, as in a game of chess, of like, how do I increase my leverage? How do I make sure the other person actually reacts? And how do I build up the trust? What kind of signals do I provide? Yeah. So.
No, thank you very much. I'm going to change tack a little bit now and go to Brendan. And my question to Brendan is about whether we humanitarians are actually in control of the changes that we see, have the changes that you have seen over the years, Brendan, are they happening as a result of things that are happening outside of the system, globalization, technological change and the like, or are they happening because we've got really good at our quid pro and so on and so forth, and actually making it happen ourselves? What's your view on that?
Well, I'll get my bus fare by saying it obviously is both, and I think the paper is very clear in trying to challenge us to accept that there are internal things over which the so-called system has some control and things on the outside, and the way to manage change is to articulate both. I've just changed my business card to failed change manager after the vote at the beginning of this session. But my sort of cynical view is that what I have lived through is a so-called system that is actually a set of, those jugglers with spinning plates. And we are rewarded to keep our plate spinning. And the whole of the professionalization is focused on, and it comes back to your strong point about we are a supply-side business, and we try to professionalize our way that we manage our spinning plate. And so whatever model you have, it's then the question of can you articulate those spinning plates into a more coherent whole, and how do you recognize the external environment? But the sad thing is that I think we still incentivize the better, faster and more efficient way that we run our plate, and we don't incentivize the other key points been coming across from the table, which is that nobody has the answer. So collaborative action is absolutely at the center of change management. But we live in a resource-poor environment, so actually our model is competitive. We actually have to show how we are different and better in order to attract scarce resources into our plate spinning business. So that's the sort of slightly negative position I think that I have come to. And then that is compounded by, if we're in, what is limiting managing the internal change side of this dichotomy that you've set up, which I'm arguing shouldn't be a dichotomy. We've got to learn how to make it work. But on looking at the internal thing, because I think we're schizophrenic. We are managed as a supply-side organization or organizations, but we want to be judged by being a consumer-led, affected population-driven business. So I think we close in because we're living this uncomfortable dilemma of being rewarded for one thing but being judged by another. And so, again, I come back to what's being said. If we can't articulate and communicate a unifying vision, we won't move forward. So I think at the heart of it, it is not a technical organisational issue, it's a cultural issue, and again, that's right at the centre of the paper. And so I will go away with Paul's story. I think stories about putting the human at the centre of our analysis is the thing that potentially drives change, and so I'm right with you. And I had the benefit or privilege of going to a Harvard executive business thing paid for by the World Bank, thank you. And I came away having been exposed to change management in a lot of different sectors. And I think if I have a criticism, we are a bit inward looking and bedeviled by the challenges that we live with and don't look out enough. And, excuse me, I'll just have a drink. Rather like Paul's story, the thing I could remember after weeks of having my head beaten in by incredibly bright people was the managing director of Alcoa, which is the big American aluminium company. He was hired, and his first big business meeting with all the investors, he stood up and said, "I'm going to make Alcoa a company where there is zero tolerance for industrial accidents." And everybody's what is this man on about? We've hired some hippie who hasn't understood business processes. And over 10 years, focusing on people, focusing on a clear, simple message, he turned the business round because suddenly it was a people-centered business. It had to have the view of the people who were falling off ladders into hot cauldrons of melted metal. And over 10 years, he multiplied the value of the business by 5 and the share value by 5. But just by a simple vision that was easy to communicate and that was people-centered. And I think so. For me, that's where we ought to be starting, because that's actually what our rhetoric is about. And one other story, I was involved with Kantar, which is the big market research company, and I got them to meet with leaders of some of the UK INGOs and humanitarians. And their lesson to us was, do you know what your customer wants? And do you know what your competitors are doing? And it's the two things we have been historically very weak on, and about the best example in terms of knowing what affected populations is the lovely ground truth, but it's still fighting for being embedded. And Kantar said, look, we've got market researchers in every single capital around the world. Why aren't you using these people to do real-time getting out, talking to survivors, building you a picture? And why don't you know who is best at doing what, and either competing with them to make sure they do it better, or move and do. So two simple sort of components of sort of change and leadership outside our sector, I think might be helpful. And then I'll stop. But just in terms of the internal changes, I am still absolutely convinced that cash is the big change opportunity that puts power into local purchase, local markets. It changes the whole dynamic. So, and that is an internal sort of supported. I mean, a bit the problem is that we're never quite sure whether host governments and donors are inside the tent or outside the tent, but clearly they are absolutely crucial. But if we adopt and fight for cash, then I think that is a real opportunity for change across the whole sector. The other one is, I think, preparedness. The fire brigade, 90% of their time is practicing and getting better at, 10% responding. We're about 90% responding and 10% trying to work out how we should be prepared. All of these things need to be. And I think then clearly there are some really good examples that are growing about collaborative action, and whether it's the clusters with all their strengths and weaknesses. But we are, I think, late in the day realising, and as the report is challenging us to do, to find models of collaborative action that can stand against the sort of competitive, divisive way that we're structured.
Brendan, thank you so much for that. Much food for thought. Very quickly, just like to turn to Paul. You've heard a lot there, Paul. Any kind of instant reflection that you want to chip in with at this point?
One very brief reflection on the grand bargain, because I thought, I mean, there's so much there, but
yes.
hopefully we can, group here and online can interrogate and talk about some of that. On the grand bargain, I think, just to underline some of the things that colleagues here have said, there's three things quite special, I think, about the design. The recognition of power. Recognising that actually change is, politics is involved, and it's not an apolitical environment, and I think taking that front and centre is very effective. I think expanding the stakeholders, as you said, to actually include the donors. The donors were always part of that system, and so they had to be in that conversation. Very powerful. I think having this container approach where you have goals but you don't have a plan to get to it. So I think all three of those things. I think three challenges. And I know much less about the process than either of you do, but three challenges that I perceive might be there. I think the first is and Melissa, you spoke to this. If it's working, it's going to get messy. If it doesn't get messy, it is kind of not working. It's sterile. Things aren't changing. There is no conflict. There's no. As it gets messy. And as it gets further out, as more and more people become involved, these are symptoms of success in a change process. However, those symptoms of success then create their own challenge. And the challenge is, how do you have that messiness going on in all sorts of different places in such a way that people can see the whole as well as the parts? And I think this platform thing is really important, so salute you for doing that. I think the other two things are, questions to those involved in the grand bargain is, are the processes that they are using like the future they would wish to be involved in, or like the past that they're trying to move away from? Because that's a key. You can kill something immediately by, you don't get things different by doing them the same. If you're producing a lot of paper on the less paper, more aid, it's probably not going to work. So trying to harmonise the process with the result. And then the third thing is expectations. It worried me a little bit that 1 year on, there was this expectation that, 1 year on and what's happened, and we've got the annual, and it kind of, what realistically did people think was going to have happened around something that ambitious in 12 months? What worries me about that is that the people involved, if they believe that 1 year on nothing really is happening and they haven't revolutionised the world in a year, and they get bored and they move on to doing something else, because there is this requirement to invest for a long period of time.
John, can I just build on the messiness?
Please
I
do.
think that's really helpful, and perhaps I dwelt on internal change or the opportunities. It's crucial that we acknowledge and respond positively to the external changes, because those are real opportunities. And clearly we haven't met, but the digital revolution is completely changing the way that we are going to be asked to respond. And it offers, again, the chance to be affected population-led. I don't know if you saw in the news today, there's a wonderful picture a sad picture in Puerto Rico of people with their mobile phones just within about a 50-yard radius of a mobile repeater mast, trying to get a signal in order to link up with the people that disaster-affected populations always respond to first, which is their family and friends. That's where they look for. So this is going to change the dynamic. And urbanization in all its ramifications, again, are changing the whole way that we need to operate. So we need to embrace that rather than run away from it.
Thank you, Brendan. Melissa, I saw you nodding when Paul was speaking, particularly when he was speaking about messiness. Did you want to say anything about that?
Yes, we were talking earlier, and I was saying right now a lot of people are confused about where the Grand Bargain stands year on, and part of that confusion, as it's noted in your paper, is normal as part of a change process. You're going to have disagreements. If you didn't have disagreements, then something would be wrong. So we just need a mechanism to handle that. And I do think that if you talk to any of the Grand Bargain signatories now, none of them has a full picture of all 10 work streams and all 52 commitments. But some of them are very passionate about the IATI data standard or the 25% localization target. So if you look at it as a collective, some of us are very passionate. How can we keep that passion and momentum? So there is a new development now with the World Bank CEO, Kristalina Georgieva, coming back on board as an eminent person. So we're hoping that her re-entry into the whole process will breathe some fresh air and rejuvenate our enthusiasm. Yesterday, one of the members of the Grand Bargain signatory group said 1 year on, if you had a child, you have a 1-year-old child, you wouldn't expect them to be able to walk. So we need to give ourselves time to support this thing, and it will be messy, but we love it, potentially, and we want to see it thrive.
I want to make sure that the audience here have an opportunity to ask some questions. Just before I do that, we're just going to ask Andras and Melissa, if there's one thing that you think is necessary to make the Grand Bargain process a success, what would it be?
Wow.
Sorry, I'll put you on the spot there, haven't I?
Yes, exactly, yeah.
I know.
Because there's only one thing. Can I make it 3?
Go on then, quickly.
Okay. I think first because the Grand Bargain has ingredients that could end up being quite revolutionary and quite transformative. I think what's really important is to keep that high visibility in that global marketplace of ideas that we have. So compared to new way of working, compared to the refugee compact, or even transformative agenda. So it's very important to maintain that high visibility because it has that potential. Second, I think it will be very important to keep up that pressure, whether it comes from the general public who are interested about this localization agenda, or whether it comes from annual reports, or whether it comes from work streams, sort of peer pressuring each other of like how much have you done. So that will be very important. And third, I think it's making it a success will require, thinking about, again, the field, so about the country context. We talk a lot, in this first year about global processes, headquarters, discussing, what the marker means and all that stuff. Yes. But ultimately, we need to see change on the ground. And here maybe I'm going to go a little bit against Melissa, that I think there's a lot of impatience on the ground, and I know we should be patient, and change takes time, but there's a lot of impatience, and that is quite counterproductive. And it's very difficult to tell people that, hey, just lean back. It will come. They want to see changes now, and some of the discussions in the country level, as I understand, already include that kind of, okay, so we both signed up for this Grand Bargain. You agreed, 8 organizations telling donors, you agreed to give us, to decrease the earmarking of your finances. So why don't we see any of that? And it's, poisoning the discussion, and they're asking the same thing. Well, you agreed that you'll, do better needs assessments, or you will do a better response, and we don't see any of that. So I think what's really important is exactly on the country level, we need to be able to find a way to leverage this process in a very positive way, and in making that more about finding that vision, and the vision again is that shift of decision making power to aid organizations, and to work towards that, build up that trust, because I think if we just wait another year or two, the prospects are not great. So it's high time.
Brilliant. Melissa, what do you think?
I think you will be seeing, if you give us a chance, you will be seeing some country-level expressions of what the grant bargain is trying to do. There have been some recent developments with regard to multi-year planning that will be rolled out in several countries. And there are some things that we're trying to do. For example, your organization has helped come up with an analysis looking at all the donor reports. If we could boil down all the questions to 8 questions plus a bonus 3. So we're actually testing out a harmonized, simplified reporting approach in Iraq, Somalia, and Myanmar. And we'd like to, as we've been talking with some of the grant bargain signatories, once we can roll that out and test it, and it's a prototype, so we don't want to roll it out too quickly and then people are even more frustrated because they need to learn it. But we're looking for opportunities to have that kind of quid pro quo in those specific country contexts and to give more visibility to some flagships. So we hear you. We hear the frustration. We're frustrated too. We'd like to move forward. But when you come up with things that require harmonization of approach between donors, UN, and NGOs, it's going to take time to get it right, and we don't want to roll out something too quickly and then make the situation at the end of the day, as we were saying, we don't want it to be more bureaucratic when we're supposed to be more efficient.
So thank you very, very much.